George, is it sorry, Seth, is it possible that you're on mute
I
when
am on
speaking?
mute. Apologies. So I was just saying, thank you everybody for joining the One Letter Wednesday at 10 in the morning Eastern Time, American time. We have Lucie and Anna calling from Prague. They're from the AREC Solutions team, followed by George as well from the Global Key Solutions team. So I'm going to give it to George to kick us off. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks everyone for joining us this month. We're really happy to have some guests from the AREG team. Anna and I will be sort of talking about from regulatory surveillance to so what? What does it matter and why? So sort of giving the entire pre-market of what surveillance means all the way to and through the post-market. Anna, if you'd like to introduce yourself and
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or whatever, good day, depending where you are. My name is Anna. I'm half of the AREC. The second half is Lucie, online with us as well. And we are having a global regulatory strategy consultancy, focused not entirely only on regulatory, but also on the overarching themes in the pharma and biotech sector.
And I'm happy to introduce myself. I am the co-founder and CEO of Global Key Solutions Corp. We track and monitor global regulatory agencies. And one of our products that we use to help facilitate some of the data for the GKS slides of the webinar is KeyPedia. We've asked always KeyPedia to introduce itself. It's a regulatory assistant capable of helping us find, track, and monitor different information. So without further ado, Anna, I'll go into your slides.
Thank you very much. So I'll start a bit with theory. I hope it won't be too long and too dull. So if you're having any questions or any concerns, or if I start to be boring, just raise your hands or step in. I'm happy to, interact. So feel free to do so. Starting with the regulatory intelligence and kind of thinking of what it actually is, it's definitely not a data collection, because just pure data won't tell you anything. So it truly brings the context which needs to be interpreted with the data together, so that it helps to answer what kind of impact or what meaning it brings to your product, whether it is a small molecule, large biologic, or a medical device. It doesn't matter. So it's not a simple surveillance, which is monitoring and collecting the data, but it is that intelligence piece, which is bringing the interpretation, picking up the right data, putting them into the right context, and that kind of circular back and forth between collecting the right data and interpreting them, and again, validating and checking the context is important for the regulatory intelligence. On the next slide, we have kind of why it is important. The good regulatory intelligence is supporting or can support a lot of important steps in the pharmaceutical sector, but it is valuable only if it has the power to influence or inform decisions. So it feeds, and that's outlined on the next couple of slides, into the specific activities which which the pharmaceutical teams, it doesn't have to be regulatory, it can be R&D, it can be quality, it can be supply, it can be a lot of commercial and marketing teams, what they are doing, and depending on at which stage they are. So let's have a look at the next slide. And we are speaking still a bit of theory on the geographical scope and primary sources of the regulatory intelligence, because a company may operate only in one region, let's say only in US, But that doesn't mean that the regulatory intelligence should be focused solely on US. Inherently, it should be global to some extent because there are key aspects which are influencing one region by the other. For example, very typically, the pricing discussions are influencing many regions. The recent pricing changes in the US are, and we are seeing changes and impacts on the Europe, are resulting into selective decisions on timing of the product launches in Europe, simply because referencing doesn't have to be necessarily that advantageous. So the core typical regions which are monitored are obviously US, Europe, some others. For some products, it makes a lot of sense to monitor sorry, WHO and other regions. And important is to cover the primary sources. Sorry, guidelines, and generally outputs from the health authorities, assessment reports, advisory committees, outcomes, so that they show how the rules are applied in practice by the regulator.
Yeah, and
Sure.
I would be happy to add a few things in here. You know, you mentioned some of these core regions and how even a singular facility and a singular country may want to open themselves up to monitoring, you know, a global landscape. Some other reasons for that, you know, we can sort of think about that both for pre-market activities and then in the post-market too, around the ideal that oh, I get some echo. But the ideal that essentially it's really important because if you're exporting to those nations, right, you're subject to that import-based scrutiny as well, particularly, for example, with US FDA, right? So there's a wealth of reasons why different groups would want to employ a global perspective, which is interesting, right?
No, absolutely. And it's very relevant with the global world, and our industry is extremely globalized, using all kind of reliance systems, recognition routes, whatever else. And you are seeing it with monitoring the agencies and the data which they are coming from, because everyone is kind of cautious if FDA issues an alert. Everyone is very cautious if EMA triggers a safety investigation on pharmacovigilance system. That's kind of like an avalanche going through all of the regions. So that's why I think it's extremely important to consider global scope of the intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we can go to the next one. When you're looking at the regulatory intelligence across the product lifecycle, I was speaking about the relevance of the regulatory intelligence. As long as you have the right data, information, and the right context, it should be helpful and informative for your decisions and next steps. That's valid basically through the whole product lifecycle, from early stages of the development through the authorization to the post-authorization. So there are some examples listed on this slide. I won't be going through them one by one, you all can read. But what I think is extremely important is at the early stage, the target product profile alignment and continuous evolvement of the target product profile and validation whether it is still relevant. And then for that, the regulatory intelligence is extremely important because the market is constantly evolving, competition is constantly evolving, guidelines are constantly evolving, insights are kind of being collected from the clinical trials ongoing or from new approaches, new scientific explorations, and so on. So I think one of the most important items at the early stage is to have regulatory intelligence feeded into the target product profile and continued on monitoring and kind of updating that insight, because it can influence and inherently impact all of the other items listed here. It can inform the regulatory pathway, expectations on the data generation, and so on. And similarly to the authorization phase, available data can help you anticipate which kind of questions and comments you will receive.
And then, yeah, I'm seeing just a couple other things to add here, beyond pre-authorization, authorization, post-authorization. I think it's also good to think about sort of the groups that are in these phases, who has to execute this type of work and why they might be using that data can be interesting. I see Dan, you're also on the call if you had any comments.
Yeah.
Zeph, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I find that it's very typical within pretty much every member of the network. Regulatory data, it's always there. Regulatory intelligence. The key is going to be are members of the network able to do the right interpretation on what is the expectation, because as it goes for like GMP discussions, it's the same with regulatory intelligence. People are able to have access to the data, the information, but in the end, as it is with any regulatory information that is generated by the authorities, you still have to do a certain level of interpretation. So as much as I like to see that the data is there, my concern remains to be, are we making the right interpretation? And that to me is a challenge that the industry has to face. In some cases, challenge is serious for some products. In other cases, it's not that serious, but it does have a certain implication. That's my comment, George.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. I mean, I think that even beyond post-market implications, Reg Intel has really accelerated in the pre-market phases as well. One analysis we recently did, Dan, I'm not even sure that we caught you up on it, was we took all of the CRLs and we looked at NDA and BLA applications, the chances of a pre-approval inspection. And then what we actually found was if there was past inspection history, and that was poor, then your chances of a PAI went up significantly. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
And then some other interesting findings out of that. Maybe I'll save for the end.
Yeah. So I don't know, and I think I'm going through a cold as well. So I really appreciate that you're going through this. And so I'm hesitant to talk, and I'm glad I'm not the one doing the talking today. But I don't know if you heard my comments, and I wanted to see if you had any sort of perspective on that.
No, absolutely. And I'm completely aligned with you because are we giving the right interpretation is the million-dollar question, right? What we have found very useful is to kind of put together your data, put together your regulatory intelligence, put it together, form assumptions, and go and validate the assumptions one by one. Ideally with the health authority, if you have a good partner. And that's why the building of the relationship with the health authority is so important, that when you have this pile of assumptions, you can select and choose. This I can validate, I don't know, in the guideline. This is only to be validated through a discussion. And that's, I think, the way forward.
Yeah, and just to add to what you just said, and never assume that that interpretation that we have to do is something that the regulatory authorities do correctly. Sometimes you've got people in regulatory bodies that are making also the wrong interpretation of the intent of the regulation. And if you're not able to make the right interpretation, they're going to make their interpretation right or wrong, and you're going to find yourself in a certain bind that could be costly or could put you in a compliance position that you don't want to be in. So I think it's important to see that, you know, that interpretation is the obligation to have the right interpretation goes to both the regulators and the regulated.
No, absolutely. And I think it is also important to take them through your interpretation, to give them enough of points to kind of catch the line of thinking you have, and the regulatory intelligence plays a substantial role here, because you can reference their past decisions, their guidelines, some other regions' significant precedents, and you can just pull the case together for your kind of thinking and interpretation, and then tell them, this is how we think and this is how we came to it. Please let us know whether this is the right way, or whether we are missing something, or whether you are in complete disagreement. And that worked very well in the past for our projects.
Yeah, let's certainly talk too. That's a good transition into this slide.
And I think we covered a lot of that already, because there is no shame to look for the competitors and what they are doing in the regulatory intelligence. It's not that you are looking into some forbidden data. Many regulatory authorities are very transparent. They are sharing the assessment reports. They are sharing the basis for decisions, or some of the health authorities are sharing even the clinical data which was used for the regulatory decisions. So there is a lot of sources which we can use and see how the others have done that, so that we are either repeat it if it worked, or not repeat if it didn't work, or take some considerations which are specific for our case. It also helps to feed and bring insights on whether there will be any comments raised through whatever stage, whether pre-approval, during the assessment of the license, or post-approval. So there is definitely a lot of added value to look at what the others have done, and how the regulators looked at it. And there are some key questions outlined on this slide, which we are always asking when we are going through the, for example, assessment reports of the competitors or of a similar class products. It doesn't have to be necessary competitors, because that's kind of benchmarking rather than anything else, and that's important too as well. I stop here and see if anyone has any other points or idea.
I definitely want to add a couple of things. You know, especially for post-market activities, monitoring competitors is a blanket broad statement, because competition can be a product-based competition, geographic. So there's lots of ways to think about that. But the way you really want to think about sorting it is, you know, sort 1 to 2 levels down, look for tertiary and different ways of connecting. So For example, monitor competitors, yes. Monitor all the companies that import the same API that you can think of, or that might because of the drug product uses the same materials, or monitor, facilities that have relationships to what you're doing in a way that's meaningful. So it can be by product type or segment. It can be for certain keywords that, you believe are deficiencies locally, things like this. I would say there's creative ways to monitor not exactly even competitors, but relational items that if there was an alert or a change, you would certainly want to know. Obviously, that's especially for post-market based documents and things like this, but even for guidance changes or things like this, then you're really thinking more broad and, topic wise almost.
Yes, absolutely agree, because it's such a vast space of information and you need to be selective. Okay, maybe we can jump to the regulatory documents and how to turn them into the intelligence, right? So I was kind of mentioning that already. Many of the health authorities are publishing, and now they are referring to it in various terms and various associations. But in general, drug approval packages, I think, would be the general term, where you can find a summary of reviewed data and basis for the decision. I would say most detailed and most structured, where you have truly a standardized structure across every document, are issued by email. They are called European Public Assessment Reports, EPARs, and there are some other alternatives. MHRA is issuing something similar, national health authorities in Europe as well. Australia is issuing AUSPARs, and there are some other health authorities which have similar packages, although they are calling it in a different name. So that's kind of not only benchmarking what the others did, what the competitors did, or what the similar class products did, but it is also very informative of where the scrutiny was focused on. What were the questions raised? What were the main points which were problematic? Was it clinical data? Was it CMC? Was it comparability? And so on. And it also informs at what risks were accepted and which kind of commitments or data generation was requested at the point of the regulatory decision versus which were agreed to be postponed and generated for the post-approval phase. And that kind of goes very, very much in line with the example which you used, George, earlier on the inspection, whether it is pre-approval or post-approval. That's very, very helpful for the companies to understand upfront, obviously, what are the chances. Okay, so we sort of open this part as well. Regulatory intelligence can be very, very precise and product specific or class specific, or it can provide statistical trends. And it really depends on what you need at that time. I think it makes sense to follow both pathways for certain type of products, for certain occasions, but you can't. In ideal world, you would be doing both. You would be doing everything what you want, of course. But we are not living in an ideal world. The day has only 24 hours, and we need to sleep sometime, and we want to spend some time outside of work as well. So you need to be selective. You need to be very kind of cautious upfront and really select the best approach for you. Statistical trends can help you with the risk assessment, how often this may occur, what is the area of the biggest scrutiny, while the product-specific regulatory intelligence is more deep diving. Is this truly applicable to my product? Is this a theoretical class risk? Or it is a product risk, which I'm seeing right now. Do I need to put it on my watch list or not? So both of these approaches are very relevant, but they are looking at the data from a different point of view. So it is very good to think about it upfront and make a conscious decision. This is the approach which I will be using on a standard basis, and this is the approach which I should be using for this and this occasion or in some intervals.
So Anna, this is Dan. When there is a discussion about risk management, risk-based decision making, my experience has always been that the industry, some way, somehow, is somewhat comfortable about risk management activities. But then when they face the regulators, or when they think about facing the regulators, they put a brake on the use of risk management because they fear that the regulators will be overly critical or will be dismissive of the use of, risk-based approaches. Is this realistic, the use of risk management, or I mean, I know it's on paper, but when it comes to reality, that's not what I see. I don't see true risk management. It's really very conservative. Am I wrong here, or?
No, I think you were right. And I think it's a shame, to be honest. I'm not really a standard regulatory expert, I would say, because I am trying to use a lot of risk management in our negotiations. And I worked for a COVID vaccine during pandemic, so you can imagine the risks and negotiations and things which we needed to treat for the first time ever. But I think your observation is very correct. There are many companies who don't know how to use risk. Maybe they know on the paper, but not on the real examples. They may have some beautiful risk management analysis prepared, but when it comes to okay, so what triggers the risk? What triggers the mitigation? When is it time to start it? These are the items which the companies are not living through. And that's, I think, the biggest gap and problem. It may look good on paper, but they can't really flexibly implement it in the real time. And I think part of that is also because the pharmaceutical area is so broad and so expert that you may not have enough people who are understanding all of the items of the potential risks. You may not have enough people who are able to communicate that in an easy language internally across the company. So I think there could be more done on how to use risk approaches in a pragmatic day-to-day work. And then, of course, how to mitigate the risks, because risks are only half of the story. The mitigations are the second one.
Fully aligned. Thank you.
Yeah, super. I'll move on. My only comment too is, yeah, I think the discussion around risk management and other areas or other terminologies around quality management culture and all these things can be its own topic.
True. It's
Yeah.
not only quality, it's R&D and
Yeah.
all of the others. So this is kind of a check, a reality check, whether we are doing a regulatory intelligence or not. If you are collecting the data, you should make the right use of your time. You're not just collecting the data because they need to be collected. The insight should be feeding into some kind of change or decision, whether it is a validation of the decision or whether it is a change of the decision or change of timelines or mitigation strategy optimization or identification of additional risks and mitigations. So it should bring value. That's when you are using time in the right way for the regulatory intelligence. If the answer is like, yeah, this is interesting, but it's not relevant to our case, then it's a waste of time and it's not a regulatory intelligence. So maybe we'll go to the next slide.
Yeah. I'll add too, one other thing that I think is very useful is, regulatory insight can be useful to different people for different reasons. And oftentimes what we see is there are very aware people within organizations, and then there are a majority who just either because it's not in the day to day or it's not necessarily their direct responsibility, might not be in the know. That's where different tools come in to, help inform more people within the organization of what's going on, which arguably can be very helpful or not. So I think managing that is its own chasm, but
Yeah, I think it's a cultural thing. It's a company cultural thing, to be honest. A lot. So, and that sort of feeds us into the last slide of mine. Speaking about, sorry. It's time for me to stop.
yeah, this is Anna, the last slide, and we can go into KeyPedia as a wrap up. But I think we really covered well so what and why. Um, just to sort of add to what I was saying even earlier in the prior slide around tools, which you now have on this slide, is exactly that, right? Is if you're monitoring and you figured out your so what, then it's time to figure out who and how gets that information. That's where tech tools can be informative, having different either working groups. You don't want to clutter with meetings. No one needs another meeting, but or so on and so forth. But certainly thinking of how are we going to disseminate this regulatory intelligence information throughout our organization? How are we going to use it to have groups talk to each other more, not less, right? That's always a critical juncture there is, how do we get more collaboration, not less, stay on the same page, right? Oftentimes, even in small orgs, it's really easy to be just working on something and not realizing someone else is also doing that. So I think those are sort of where tools can help paginate those gaps really well and fulfill a better knowledge step there.
So
Absolutely.
George, so just to complement what you just said, intelligence is about information which should lead everybody to a certain level of knowledge. And once you have the knowledge, then you're able to execute according to that level of knowledge and intelligence that you have been surrounded with. So, but I think it's also about all of this coming together to simplify because we live in an environment where everything seems to get into a high level of complexity. And sometimes complexity comes Because there's some natural complexity associated with to what we do, but also complexity that we add because we're not comfortable, because we didn't have all the tools that were needed, all the information that was needed to actually simplify something. So I think that in the end, it's great that we have all of this, but the whole idea of what Anna is talking about and what George is going to talk about in a second, it's all about simplification. Because as things get more complex or complicated, then somebody or something is going to have to come in and implement levels of simplification so that things can be practical, usable, viable. I think that's what George is going to talk about in a second.
Yeah. And I think, and that's kind of my rule in like internally for myself, if someone is not understanding you, it's not because that matter is too complex. It's because you're not understanding it enough to be able to explain that. And that's kind of a problem of today's industry, of course. We have so many beautiful experts and wonderful experts who are understanding the core, but to step out of that comfort expert zone and try to explain that to someone outside it, it's very problematic. Like, even when we are like regulatory experts explaining, so what do you do in a pub over a beer to a friend? It's a problem to explain it in 2-3 simple sentences. So how do we expect that someone who is really a very detailed expert focused on something is stepping out? And that's, I think, where the tools can help a lot, because it can distill the trends and the high level information, but then there is still this human element which needs to add the right context at the right level and adjust that to the forums where it has practical impact. And as you were, George, saying, to find the right way for each organization, it will be most probably different how to disseminate the information, because you can't overflood people with information, but because no meeting, everyone will stop to attend the meetings, but everyone will stop to read also too long emails or too many emails. So to find some very smart spots where it makes sense to add 5 minutes window for, I don't know, Friday afternoon short email as a recap of critical information, or 5 minutes at a cross-functional meeting where it makes sense to just bring highlights of what the competitors are doing, or something like that. I think it is a task for each company itself, but I think it's very helpful and beneficial. And with that, I will stop. Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just have two quick example slides around KeyPedia, and we'll wrap up shortly, open it up for questions. So when we talk about surveillance and, what are the sources for surveillance, right? If we look at an FDA or a perspective here, I asked similar questions of KeyPedia to get a bulleted sense of, what is important, what are your sort of responsibilities in a way to complete some form of regulatory intelligence. And KeyPedia generated a few ideas for us that I thought were well aligned with the presentation. So I thought I'd show how that looks. Another good example is, okay, well, tell me more about the pre-market versus post-market perspective. What's the difference in a pre-market activity affecting a post-market activity? So that's why I highlighted that number 3 point on the bottom right. And it really transitions well into a recent article we have put out on complete response letters we made available to users of the platform. We basically used the platform, navigated through a full tutorial on the FDA's complete response letter data set. A couple really interesting things I'd note is what I had mentioned. If you are in, this is why it's important for groups to talk to each other, right? Beyond just a BLA or different type of submission to the FDA or an agency, those are signals, those are touch points, and those touch points get picked up and interpreted in some way. And so what we found was, when we look at CRLs, is what's the chances of that pre-approval inspection happening at a facility based on the pre-market activities, right? And essentially, if there's pre-market activity and there's a past compliance history in a similar area that is non-compliant in some metric or form, then oftentimes, at least from FDA CRL perspective, that facility was getting the PAI inspection. I think it was north of 60% of the time. And even as interestingly was certain things don't matter, right? So even though you're always 100% inspection ready, most facilities, right? The rate of failure was sort of non-correlating to the pre-market activity and the past, whether there was past compliance history or not. So I'll leave it with those two sort of statements on the media page. And I'll sort of wrap up and say thank you, Anna, for speaking. Thank you. So yeah.
It was interesting and very valuable and insightful discussion. So thank you for having me here. Do we have any questions, maybe?
Yeah, we can check the chat. It looks like no typed out chat questions.